Good evening. I'm Ken Girardin, Director of Policy and Research at Yankee Institute, where our mission is to make sure every man, woman, and child in Connecticut has the opportunities to succeed. Our president, Carol Platt-Liebau, sends her apologies, but had a logistics issue that kept her from joining us tonight. Tonight, we have a great guest, Jason Riley. He is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. He is the author of several previous books, including Please Stop Helping Us, How Liberals Make It Harder for Blacks to Succeed. Jason is here to talk about his terrific new biography, Maverick, a biography of Thomas Sowell. We're going to be hearing from Jason for a bit, and then I've got some questions for him, and then we're going to open up the Q&A to everyone attending. But having just read this book and having been so heavily influenced by Thomas Sowell's work, especially his basic economics textbook, I am really excited to, for all of us to have the chance to really pick Jason's brain tonight and learn more about a man who is really one of the greatest living minds of our time. So with that, Jason, it's over to you.
Well, thank you, Ken, for that kind introduction. I do a fair amount of speaking on college campuses these days, when they let me, that is. So I can't tell you how much I appreciate this change of venue this evening. So first, I want to thank the Yankee Institute for your interest in Sowell's work, and thank all of you for taking the time to be here. I just wanted to make some brief remarks about Sowell before we get into the discussion. When I was researching my biography of Tom, I kept coming across Sowell's own descriptions of scholars he admired, and I was often struck by how well those descriptions applied to Sowell himself. For example, after the Nobel Prize-winning economist George Stigler, who was one of Tom's professors at the University of Chicago, passed away, Tom wrote, quote, "In a world of self-promoting academics, George Stigler epitomized a rare integrity as well as a rare intellect. He jumped on no bandwagon, beat no drum for causes, created no personal cult. He did the work of a scholar and a teacher, both superbly, and found that sufficient. If you wanted to learn, and above all, if you wanted to learn how to think, how to avoid vague words and fuzzy thoughts or maudlin sentiments that could clod over reality, then Stigler was your man." Or here's Tom discussing another one of his mentors, Milton Friedman, whom he also studied under at Chicago. Friedman, he said, was one of very few intellectuals with both genius and common sense. He could express himself at the highest analytical levels to his fellow economists in academic publications and still write popular books that could be readily understood by people who knew nothing about economics. I'm hard pressed to come up with better ways than those to describe Thomas Sowell. When I think about his scholarship, and whether the subject is economics or history, culture, race, political philosophy, what have you, that's what comes to mind. Intellectual integrity, analytical rigor, respect for evidence, skepticism toward the kind of fashionable thinking that comes and goes. And then there's the clarity, column after column, book after book, written in plain English for general public consumption. Last June, at the age of 90, Sowell published his 36th book and his 5th since turning 80. The title is Charter Schools and Their Enemies. I hope Tom's not done writing books, but if he is, you could hardly find a more suitable swan song for a publishing career that has now spanned 6 decades. Tom's first 2 books were directed at students of economics, but his 3rd book, the semi-autobiographical Black Education, Myths and Tragedies, was published in 1972 and written for the general public. It grew out of a long article on college admissions and their standards for Black students that he wrote for the New York Times Magazine back in 1970, after leaving his own teaching post at Cornell. And it begins with a recounting of his own education, first at segregated schools in North Carolina, where he was born, and later at integrated schools in New York City's Harlem neighborhood, where he was raised. The topic of education, both at the K through 12 level and at the college level, is one that he's returned to repeatedly in his books over the decades. He's also done pioneering research on the history of Black education in the US. In fact, the preface of Charter Schools and Their Enemies describes a conversation he had in the early 1970s with the late Irving Kristol, who was the editor of The Public Interest. When Kristol asked Tom what could be done to create high-quality schools for Blacks, Tom replied that such schools already existed and had for generations. Kristol asked Tom to write about these schools for his magazine, and a 1974 issue of The Public Interest featured a long essay by Tom on the history of all-Black Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C., which had not only outperformed its local white counterparts in D.C., but had repeatedly equaled or exceeded national norms on standardized tests throughout the first half of the 20th century. Over an 85-year span, from 1870 to 1955, Tom wrote, most Dunbar graduates went on to college, even though most Americans, white or Black, did not. 2 years later, in the same publication, he wrote a second article on successful Black elementary and high school schools located throughout the country. He later told a friend that his work on Black education had been, quote, the most emotionally satisfying research I have ever done. In a sense, today's public charter schools, which often have predominantly low-income Black and Hispanic student bodies, are successors to those high-achieving Black schools that Sol researched more than 40 years ago. And as Tom points out, what's clear is that these charter schools are not simply doing a better job than traditional public schools with the same demographic groups. In many cases, inner city charter school students are outperforming their peers in the wealthiest and whitest suburban school districts in the country. In New York City, for example, the Success Academy charter schools have effectively closed the academic achievement gap between Black and white students. And as Tom writes in the book, quote, the educational success of these charter schools undermines theories of genetic determinism. It undermines claims of cultural bias in the test. It undermines assertions that Black students must be sitting next to white students in order to learn. It undermines the presumption that family income differences explain differences in educational outcomes. According to Tom, this last claim about poverty has been used for decades to absolve traditional public schools of any responsibility for the educational failures in low-income minority communities. It's clear that charter schools have such vocal and passionate enemies, not because they don't work, but because, of course, they do work, and therefore they pose a threat to the education status quo. They threaten the current power balance that allows the vested interest of adults who run public education to come before what's best for students. Bad schools stay open because those schools still provide good jobs for adults. Whether or not the children are learning is a secondary concern at best. But as Tom puts it, quote, schools exist for the education of children. Schools do not exist to provide ironclad jobs for teachers. They do not exist to provide billions of dollars in union dues for teachers' unions, or to provide monopolies for educational bureaucracies. And they certainly don't exist to provide a captive audience for indoctrinators. In recent years, charter school skeptics have made headway. Limits have been placed on how many can open and where they can be located. Bill Clinton and Barack Obama both supported charter schools, but Democrats and progressives have moved sharply to the left on education more lately. And the rhetoric coming out of the Biden administration is far more skeptical of charters, all of which makes Sol's book as timely as anything he's ever written. One of the reasons I wanted to write this book is because so much of Tom's scholarship, not just on education, remains relevant to our policy debates today. We're still talking about economic inequality, affirmative action, social justice, critical race theory, slavery reparations, the efficacy of minimum wage laws, the pros and cons of immigration, and so forth. Tom's writings have addressed all of these topics. Frankly, I find it depressing and outrageous that so many people today know names like Ta-Nehisi Coates, Ibram Kendi, Nicole Hannah-Jones, and Cornel West, but not Thomas Sowell. Sowell's scholarship runs circles around those individuals, maybe around all of them put together. But it's not just the volume of his writings that surpasses them. It's also the range and depth and rigor of his analysis, which they don't come close to matching. He anticipated many of their arguments decades ago and refuted them decades ago, in some cases before the people making them today were even born. To the extent that Sowell is known, it's mostly for his writings on racial controversies. But most of his books are not on racial themes, and Sowell would have distinguished himself as a first-rate scholar even if he'd never written a single word about race and ethnicity. Another reason I wanted to write this book was to showcase his writings in these other areas. Tom is an economist by training, specializing in the history of economic thought and the history of ideas. But he's also a historian, a sociologist, a political philosopher, and a social theorist. One person described him as one of our great intellectual trespassers, someone unafraid to go wherever his talent takes him. Earlier this year, Sowell was awarded something called the Hayek Prize. It's named after the influential Austrian economist and political philosopher Friedrich Hayek. Because of the pandemic, Sowell couldn't travel, and I was asked to accept the award on his behalf. In my remarks, I said that one of the nice things about Thomas Sowell receiving this year's Hayek Award is that we know with a pretty high degree of certainty that Hayek himself would have approved of the choice. In fact, Hayek might have said, "What took you so long?" Sowell was not only a student of Hayek's work, but also an actual student of Professor Hayek in the early 1960s at the University of Chicago. Sowell wrote a paper about the French economist Jean-Baptiste Say for Hayek's class on the history of ideas. The paper received very high praise from Hayek and was later published in an academic journal. And Hayek would later publicly praise Sowell's 1980 book on social theory, knowledge and decisions, in the most flattering terms imaginable. Hayek wrote a review of the book in Reason magazine, and my favorite part is the beginning, where Hayek describes how when he first received a copy, he put it aside because he was too busy with his own research to read it. Later, when he finally got around to reading Tom's book, he says he regretted having put it aside because he said he would have made much faster progress on his own research had he stopped and read Tom's book first. Later in the review, Hayek called the book, quote, an original achievement that broadened the application of Hayek's own scholarship and, quote, effectively carried the approach into new fields that I never considered. Now, keep in mind that Friedrich Hayek was already Friedrich Hayek when he said that. He'd already written The Road to Serfdom. He'd already won his Nobel Prize and already was considered one of the great economists of the 20th century. My point is that even if Sowell had never written a single word about racial preferences, his body of work in other areas would be worthy of our attention. But let me close this out the way I started, by quoting something that Tom wrote about Hayek. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of Hayek's Road to Serfdom, Sowell wrote a long appreciation of the book for Forbes magazine. And here's what he said about the author. Hayek's analysis, he wrote, whether in The Road to Serfdom or in his books on law, economics, or political philosophy, begins with the inherent constraints of human life and with the necessary implications of those constraints as particular policies are put into place. The issue is not what anyone intends. The issue is what consequences are in fact likely to follow. At a minimum, we must make our choices among the alternatives actually available. And when we choose something impossible to achieve, the disappointments and dangers that follow are not accidental. Socialism, comprehensive economic planning, and social justice were to Hayek all impossible dreams, unquote. Once again, that sounds very much like a summary of the scholarship of Thomas Sowell, and I certainly couldn't have said it any better than that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. I was remiss in my opening remarks to say that this is really a different kind of biography, what you've done here, and I want to compliment you on the way you set out to, rather than just tell the story of birth to 90 about Tom Sowell, but to talk about his journey as a thinker, which is much, much harder work. because that's about telling the story of everyone and everything around him rather than just what was going on in his life in particular. And pursuant to that, I want to say, I'd like you to tell a little bit about the story, because I think this will really surprise our audience. I know it surprised me when I was reading the book. I think my jaw actually dropped when I got to it. But Tom Sowell did not start life as an evangelist for free markets.
No.
I think that's kind of an understatement. You could tell us a little bit about his dabbling with the dark side at a young age, and how that his early ideology, walking away from that, is a compliment to him as an empiricist, as someone who really does follow data.
Sure. First, it's not uncommon for people who are conservatives later on in life to have started on the left. Milton Friedman started on the left. Ronald Reagan started on the left. It's just not that unusual, and particularly among Black conservatives, who not only, it seems to me, start out on the left typically, or a little left of center, but start out on the far left, the radical left. Clarence Thomas was a Black Panther. Shelby Steele, the race scholar at the Hoover Institution, where Tom is based, was a radical leftist in the 1960s. Walter Williams, recently deceased libertarian economist who was a good friend of Tom's. His views were much closer in his early days to the views of Malcolm X than they were to the views of Martin Luther King. So Sowell also started out on the left, and it's probably, it's not, when you think about where he started out in life, it makes some sense. You're talking about someone who was born in 1930 in the Jim Crow South during the Great Depression, into an extremely poor family. He was orphaned as a child, never knew his mother, who died in childbirth to a younger sibling, and never knew his father, who died before Tom was born. He was taken in by a distant relative who moved the family first to Charlotte, North Carolina, and then when Tom was 9, up to Harlem, where he was raised. And he was a smart kid, but he had a pretty tumultuous home life and ended up dropping out of school. Sowell never graduated from high school. He left home at the age of 17, struck out on his own, and took these menial jobs. And this is where he discovered Karl Marx as a teenager. He purchased a copy of secondhand encyclopedias, and the entry on Marx and Marxism grabbed him. And he was sort of self-taught through his late teens, and really taken in by these writings. And at the time, he was working as a messenger for Western Union. So this is the late 1940s. And he talks about how the office was located in Lower Manhattan, down in the Wall Street district, but he lived up in Harlem, so he basically had to traverse the entire island of Manhattan to get home every day. And sometimes he would take a double-decker bus home and sit on the upper deck and just sort of watch the neighborhoods change as the bus went north. Goes through the Wall Street district, goes up Fifth Avenue through these fancy shopping districts like Saks Fifth Avenue and so forth, goes past Carnegie Hall, goes up Riverside Drive, a wealthy residential neighborhood. And then he would cross this viaduct, and there would be the tenements, the ghetto, where he would get off. And he'd look around and he'd say, what just happened? Why does this look like this up here versus where I started off and what I saw before I got here? And he said, Marx explained it. Marx had an explanation for this. People were being exploited. There was this battle to the death between the capitalist and the proletariat, the owners and the workers, and it made sense to Tom. It was something he could embrace, and he did. And Tom remained a Marxist. He eventually was drafted into the Marines during the Korean War, and started to sort of turn his life around then. Was able to go to college on the GI Bill, started out at Howard University, the all-Black school in DC, and then transferred to Harvard, and then went on to Columbia, and eventually the University of Chicago to study under Stigler, and Friedman. All the while, Sol remained a Marxist, even after studying for his doctorate under Friedman and Stigler. And he didn't hide the fact, they knew it. Sol talks about his conversion beginning after leaving his studies and working in the Department of Labor in the early 1960s and studying minimum wage laws. He thought that these were of benefit to low-income people, and particularly low-income minorities. But as he studied this issue while working at the Department of Labor, he saw negative employment effects for minorities in particular, and for low-income people resulting from minimum wage. And it not only caused him to rethink his views of minimum wage, but his views of socialism and the benevolent role of government to be taken for granted in general. And this is what started his conversion away from his leftism and toward a more free market approach to these ideas. So it was a combination of study, of book learning, and real life experience. And I'll just give you another example of how he combined the two to inform his views as a scholar later on. He talks about having another job, working for the US Public Health Service in the late 1950s when he was in undergraduate school. He worked at the headquarters of the US Public Health Service in Washington, DC. And one day, toward the end of work, a man had a heart attack on the sidewalk outside the building. They brought him in, they took him to the nurse's office. But they discovered that he wasn't a government employee, and therefore he could not be treated in that building. And so they called an ambulance to come and take him someplace where he could be treated. And the man died waiting for the ambulance. And Sol said this sort of dramatized for him the nature of bureaucracies, government bureaucracies or bureaucracies in general, and their emphasis on procedures, processes, rather than results. As the way he put it in his memoir was, a man died waiting for a doctor in a building full of doctors. It made no sense. And so it was another real life experience of Tom's that he brought later on in life to his scholarship and his skepticism of certain things that he would later critique. It wasn't just book knowledge, it was this personal experience. And because he had such an unusual upbringing for an intellectual, for a scholar, I think it's made his scholarship that much more unique, that it's informed by these real world experiences.
And that's the wild thing that your book hits on. It's that he was born this way. I mean, he was looking for that unified theory as a teenager on the double-decker buses, watching the transition of the neighborhoods in Manhattan. So we've been treated to, almost 70 years of him as a professional, applying that to the world and fleshing it out. And that is part of what makes your book so great. Along the way, as an empiricist, he's encountered some pretty fierce criticism. If we can just turn to that. At one point, the New York Times ran something like a 12,000 word hit piece on him in their book magazine. You talk about how he had to postpone a planned vacation to rebut it, but he's always handled this criticism and these attacks with such grace and with substance, and in a way that he's always almost come away stronger as a result. Could you tell us a little more about that and just that level of criticism he's faced over the years?
Oh, sure. I mean, it's come from different quarters. Just to be clear, the essay you're referring to ran in the New York Review of Books. It wasn't a New York Times essay. In fact, it was interesting, and this says a lot more about the Times maybe than about Tom, but in the 1970s and 80s, even, Tom would publish regularly in the New York Times and in the New York Times Magazine. They ran long pieces by Tom, particularly the magazine. I mentioned, I think in my remarks, that one of his early books, Black Education, Myths and Tragedies, came out of a long essay that he had written for the New York Times Magazine after he left teaching in the late 60s. So it tells you a lot about the New York Times today, but they used to be a publication that was open to running contrarian views at some length in their pages for readers. But yes, Sol has been faced quite a bit of criticism, and it really began in earnest in the 1970s when he started writing about racial controversies. Again, Tom's first discipline had been economic history and the history of ideas. And that's what he focused on mostly in the 1960s when he was teaching. Tom was in academia for 2 decades, the 60s and the 70s. But starting in the 1970s, he began to weigh in on various racial controversies. He had been an early supporter of the traditional civil rights movement. But in the late 60s, he started to part ways ideologically with the movement. He did not like the move from a focus on equal outcomes, or I should say a focus on equal opportunity, to a focus on equal outcomes and special preferences for Blacks. He thought that was the wrong way to go. He also critiqued the way that the traditional civil rights leaders, following the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, seemed to put a lot more emphasis in integrating political institutions, getting more Black officials elected as a means of increasing the size of the Black middle class. The thinking was, if we can just put more of our own in office, all the rest will take care of itself. The education disparities, the economic disparities, all of our focus needs to be put on electing more Black officials at the state and local level. And Sol thought that that was barking up the wrong tree. And he began writing about this stuff in the 1970s, and that's when he ran into trouble. I mean, to use today's parlance, he got canceled. He was a critic of affirmative action. He was a critic of the traditional civil rights leadership. And Black elites in particular took umbrage at this. And they were able to go to media outlets and paint Tom as someone who was not to be engaged on these racial issues, whose opinion was not to be taken seriously, who was not offering a legitimately Black point of view. And that is when the criticism really began in terms of Sol's scholarship. And it has continued to this day. And it's one of the reasons I believe that he isn't as well known as your Ta-Nehisi Coates and your Ibram Kendis and your Nicole Hannah-Joneses and your Cornel West and so forth. Even though, again, I think both the volume and the rigor of his scholarship they don't come close to matching. So Tom has been an intellectual he's someone who's distinguished himself as a public intellectual, I should say, by his adherence to empiricism, to facts, to following the data where it leads, and to reporting the findings, even if they're politically incorrect, even if they are unpopular. And you think about it, that shouldn't really distinguish you as an intellectual. But in today's world, it does. And he's paid a price for that adherence to empiricism. He's paid a price in terms of prestige and notoriety. The left largely controls the media. The left largely controls academia, controls the academic circles that hand out the awards and the prizes. And Tom has simply refused to play footsie with these folks over the decades. And I think he's paid a price for that.
Yeah, and one of the worst parts of the criticism against him is that it often attacks his perceived motives, or in some cases, the critics were flat out putting words in his mouth, and he had to spend so much time in the public eye just rebutting those things that he never said in the first place.
Yes, and I think it's even goes a little deeper than that. In researching for the book, I came across a lot of interviews where Tom was asked a certain type of question in various forms over and over again. And it was basically went something like, how does it feel to go against the grain of so many fellow Blacks? How does it feel to be someone in your position who does that? And Sol would always correct the premise of the question and say, no, I don't go against the grain of most Blacks. I go against the grain of most Black intellectuals, most Black elites. And Black elites are no more representative of everyday Blacks than white elites are of everyday whites, he would say. And this has proven true on issue after issue over the decades. It was true when he was saying it in the 1970s with regards to things like school busing. The NAACP, organizations like that, were in favor of busing, wanted to put these Black kids on buses for 2 hours every day and send them out into white school districts to integrate those districts. Parents, Black parents, never wanted that. Busing never pulled high among Blacks. They wanted good schools built right there in their neighborhoods. But the Black elites wanted busing. It's true today in terms of voter ID laws. The Black elites support them. I'm sorry, Black elites oppose them, whereas the Black masses support voter ID. A majority of Blacks support voter ID. This whole defund the police movement is supported by Black activists. It is imposed overwhelmingly by a majority of Blacks. So you can just go to issue on issue. School choice is another issue. Charter schools and vouchers pull off the charts among most Blacks, but are opposed by Black elites. So on issue after issue after issue, Tom has been proved right on this. And if anything, the gap between the thinking and the proclamations of these self-proclaimed Black spokesmen, the elites, the academics, the intellectuals, the people you listen to on CNN and MSNBC, their views are becoming further and further and further divorced from those of a majority of Blacks. So that's also something he's had to deal with in terms of criticism over the years. You don't speak for Blacks, we do, when in fact, often the case is the opposite, is closer to the truth.
Indeed. I'm wondering, I just want to give
just to add to that, the latest example of this would be critical race theory, frankly, which is really just a fancy argument for racial preferences. And lest you think I'm being overly reductive here, keep in mind that critical race theory came out of the 1970s, and it came out of law schools, academia. And the argument that the critical race theorists made were that a person's race and ethnicity, they argued, should be used as an academic credential in hiring the faculty. That was their argument for critical race theory. It was an argument for racial preferences. Today, it continues to be an argument for racial preferences. And one of the points that Tom has made, not only in his critiques of civil rights leadership and Black elites, but in his critiques of intellectuals in general, he has argued, particularly in books like Knowledge and Decisions, that properly understood, intellectuals are simply just another special interest group, and they need to be treated as such. This whole idea that we should just automatically defer to the so-called experts on things ignores the fact that they have their own agenda. They have always had their own agenda, and we should keep that in mind when evaluating their comments and their positions. It's not that you automatically reject everything that is said or that comes out of elite circles or intellectual circles in academia, because you need to view it with the same type of skepticism that you would view any other special interest group. And one of the things that elites have managed to do increasingly over the decades, and that Sol has written about over the decades, because he has written about intellectual history, is to present themselves as this disinterested, neutral, objective body that the rest of us in society should simply defer to automatically. And Sol has illustrated the dangers of doing that. And his critique of the civil rights leadership is of a piece with a larger critique of intellectualism.
I think we could take another 2 hours going down this down the subject where both you and Dr. Sol have written extensively on it. I'm going to pivot very quickly back to the book itself. Father's Day is coming up. If I'm going to recommend that folks pick up 2 books for Father's Day, one of them is Maverick. What would be your recommendation for Thomas Sol's best work?
Well, if you've never read anything by him or haven't read much by him, he published a book in 2011 called The Thomas Sol Reader. And it's a nice sampling of book chapters from his various publications, columns, longer essays on a range of issues, economics, law, education, race, culture, and so forth. And it's just a nice sampling of his work. And I think it would give you a nice taste of Tom and his scholarship. If you want to dig a little deeper, I would turn to his own favorite of his books, which is A Conflict of Visions. It's a deeper dive into Tom's thinking and how he thinks about not just racial or ethnic issues, but the type of intellectual framework he brings to his discussion of just about anything he's writing about. And what he does in this book, it's a book about political philosophy. And he argues that, broadly speaking, our political disputes, our cultural disputes, our social disputes in society, dating back hundreds of years, can really be traced to two conflicting visions of human nature and how the world works. And he calls one the constrained vision, or sometimes he calls it the tragic vision. And then on the other hand, he says you have this unconstrained vision of humanity, or this utopian vision. And the constrained vision says that there are limits to human betterment. We may want to end war, end crime, end racism, but it's probably not going to happen. So the best thing that we can do is to create institutions and processes that help us deal with problems, manage problems that we're probably never, ever going to solve entirely. And so, you may want world peace, but it's probably not going to happen. So building a military defense is probably a good idea. You may want crime and prejudice to end, but that too is unlikely to occur anytime soon. So you're going to need a court system, a rule of law to adjudicate disputes. And he contrasts that with this more utopian view that says, no, we cannot, we can do better than simply manage these problems. We can solve them entirely. It's just a matter of willpower and reason and rationalization that needs to be thrown at and resources that need to be thrown at these problems. And we cannot just manage them. We can eliminate them altogether. And furthermore, there will be no trade-offs in doing so. And Soule says, once you know which sort of vision a person is operating under, it's amazing the patterns that develop in terms of their positions on everything from military spending to school choice, to tax hikes, to regulation, to rent control. Everything sort of fits in a pattern depending on which vision they've adopted, even unconsciously. And so this book, and it's part of a trilogy. It's the first in an informal trilogy. The other two books were called The Vision of the Anointed and The Quest for Cosmic Justice. And the latter two books are more critiques of the visions themselves, and they're a little more polemical as a result. But that first book, A Conflict of Vision, just lays out this intellectual framework in which he is addressing all manner of public policy. And I think that is, if you really want to understand where Thomas Sowell is coming from on the various issues he's written about, that's the book I would pick up.
That's the unified field theory that he finally reached over,
exactly.
And that only took him, that took 4 decades of empiricism, service in the Korean War, and countless other struggles in the meantime. At this point, I want to plug our Q&A feature. If you have any questions for Jason, please put them up here and I will decide if they meet Yankee standards. In the meantime, Jason, if I could just throw a little bit of a curveball at you. Going into tonight, I was thinking about Thomas Sowell and how much he literally rewired my brain when my mentor handed me a copy of Basic Economics 7 years ago, and caused me to start looking at the entire world in terms of scarcity and price signals and everything else that Dr. Sowell put into that book. Looking at who we can count as Tom Sowell's peers, living or otherwise. So, some folks would group him with Milton Friedman, with Stiegler. I would probably count him with the polymaths of our time, like Richard Feynman. Who would you put in his league?
Wow. Well, he's dabbled in so many areas. I think he sees himself as someone operating, not to say that he considers himself the equals of these individuals, but he sees himself operating in the tradition of those classical liberal thinkers. John Stuart Mill, David Ricardo, Adam Smith, people like that. And those are the people he studied most closely. That was his first love, intellectual history. And, and the way he explained it to me is he just says, I've tried to create a body of work that that I can submit to that continuum in humanity's gain of knowledge going forward. I'm not really concerned about me getting credit for some part of it and not for others. And he talks about how some of those past thinkers felt the same way, including Mill, who he said, he just puts it all together and says, he's not worried about how much is Adam Smith, how much is David Ricardo, how much is his. It's just part of a body of knowledge that he thinks has some sort of value added in moving societies forward and having ideas prevail. He's never been one interested in personal notoriety, but he does want his ideas put out there. That's part of the reason I decided to write an intellectual biography. The first reason was that he had already written a memoir, and he'd also put out this book of correspondence called A Man of Letters back in the mid-2000s. Tom, I don't know how or why, but Tom had the foresight to not only keep copies of letters he had received going all the way back to the 50s and 60s. He made carbons of letters he sent to other people that far back. And so how he was thinking at the time about these various issues. And I find that book even more intimate than his memoir. And as his biographer, it was a gold mine. I mean, it was wonderful. But he's just someone who wants the best ideas to prevail. So his mentors were people like Friedman. Intellectually, also people like Hayek, who I think had some tremendous insights into workings of society. And anything that Sol has written about social theory, namely knowledge and decisions, I think is in Hayek's tradition as well. But I also just think Sol sees himself as a sort of old school scholar and intellectual. Someone who follows the facts. I mean, he really is not into intellectual fads. He just isn't. He's never been taken in by them. He's also someone who has been, there's a reason I titled the book Maverick. He's someone who has been willing to take on even people he agrees with mostly on most topics if he thinks they're wrong on something specific. This came up with Stigler when he was working on his dissertation on his interpretation of Say's law. It came up with Milton Friedman when he was writing about Milton was in favor of this negative income tax. Today, it's sort of been revived as a universal basic income. But Sol and Friedman went head to head on this thing. It's come up more recently in more recent decades with Charles Murray's writings on race and intelligence, which Sol has been extremely critical of. And it was nothing new for Sol. You have to keep in mind how old Tom is, but Sol had originally started writing about race intelligence or looking into it, researching it, to address the writings of a scholar named Arthur Jensen back in the 1960s. And he took on Jensen's arguments. And so when Murray, decades later, revived a lot of Jensen's claims, Sol had already studied this stuff for decades and applied a lot of that same criticism to Murray's work. But my point is that this is a guy who is an independent thinker and is most interested in that empirical following of the facts. The other thing I think he got from Friedman and Stigler was the role of a public intellectual, and how scholars shouldn't merely sit around writing and talking to their peers in the academy. They should take the time to explain their disciplines to the general public, and that's what what Friedman did after he left teaching in the 1970s, after he got his Nobel Prize. He wrote a column for Newsweek. He wrote books for popular audiences, trying to popularize economics and so forth. I think Tom really took that model of public intellectualism to heart. I mean, you mentioned Basic Economics as being an influential book. That's a book Tom said he probably could have never written had he stayed in academia. People would have said, you know, well, you should be pushing the frontiers of economic theory. What are you doing writing books about supply and demand that any decent economist already knows everything about? Well, Sowell had already written an economics textbook full of graphs and charts and about the descriptions of the elasticity of demand and so forth. He'd written that economics textbook. This one, Basic Economics, is basically an economics textbook with no charts and graphs and jargon. And it's his best-selling book. It's been translated into 7 or 8 different languages. I think it's in its 5th edition right now. He's quite proud of it. And by the way, he says that second one, Basic Economics, was a lot harder to write than the first one. But Sowell has written most of his books for general interest readers. He's written a few for his peers in the academy, but most of his books are about explaining these concepts to everyday people who know nothing about economics. And he takes great pride in doing that. And when he finally retired his column back in 2016, I remarked that, you know, a lot of people just lost the best professor they ever had, even if they never went to college. Because even though Sowell had left teaching in 1980, he had continued to sort of teach through these columns and through these books.
Well, actually, that's a great pivot there, talking about his move to Hoover. I've got a question here. As a university professor, I'm curious as to why Dr. Sowell left academia, and you have an entire chapter on that.
Yeah, so Tom's first love had been teaching and classroom teaching, not even research. He wanted to be an economics professor, preferably at a smaller college, one where you got to know your students. The problem was that this was the 1960s and academia was really changing. You had a Black rights movement, you had a women's rights movement, you had a gay rights movement, you had an anti-war movement. And all of these movements used universities as platforms. And campuses were in turmoil. Administrators and faculty didn't know how to deal with all this activism suddenly taking place on college campuses. They didn't know how their roles as teachers and instructors and administrators were supposed to adapt to this environment. And Thomas Sowell was very old school. He was someone who wanted to teach the way he had been taught. And in the 1960s, starting in the 1960s, that was increasingly difficult to do. And Tom was this guy, you know, no, you cannot be excused from class to go to a protest. No, we are not going to spend the whole period discussing the latest newspaper headlines. No, I'm here to teach economics. You're here to learn economics. No, I'm not grading on the curve. No, I'm going to not lighten my reading load. And that didn't go over well with a lot of fellow faculty members, with a lot of administrators who wanted to be much more pliant to the times. And this really came to a head for Sowell in the late 60s when he was at Cornell. He was there for those violent student protests where armed students took over buildings and put out a list of demands. And Sowell was really disgusted at how the faculty and the administration just completely capitulated to the demands of these students and how no one was willing to stand up to them. And I think it really soured him on academia. So by the end of the 1960s, I think he started to have one foot out the door. He stuck it out through the 1970s. But by that time, he was dabbling in various think tanks and doing more research and so forth. He got tenure at UCLA in the late 70s, could have stayed on there. But when Hoover came along, offered him a job at Stanford University, entirely devoted to researching and writing whatever he wanted, no teaching duties, no office hours, and so forth. He jumped at it and he took it. And, you know, there are trade-offs. And I interviewed some folks who said, you know, I wish Sol would have stuck it out in teaching, despite all the nonsense he would have had to put up with. And here's why, they said. You know, when these you know, the Cornell West and the Henry Louis Gateses and the Michael Eric Dyson, when those guys are gone, when they leave the scene, there's going to be a whole army of young leftists moving up to take their place and continue on saying the types of things that they're saying. It says, where's the next generation of Thomas Sowells? And we might have had one had he stuck it out in teaching, because there would have been thousands of graduate students who had studied under Sowell, or who had written dissertations under his guidance and so forth. But because he left in 1980, went to Hoover, and has been writing the books and the columns, we don't have that. And that's been the trade-off. And they say they wish he had stuck it out. I don't know that I entirely agree with that, because I don't know if I'd give anything for those books and all those columns that we got instead. But I see the argument. I think there is I think it's a valid critique.
And I think to a certain extent, you and I are living proof of the importance of having those sorts of institutions like Hoover, like the Manhattan Institute, like Yankee, that, you know, thank heavens Hoover existed for, you know, for giving us 40 years of Thomas Sowell's work. I'm going to combine a few questions together here, hopefully artfully, but I've got a lot of folks asking, how do they spread the word about Thomas Sowell? How do you bring that to, you know, how would you recommend that they evangelize and bring that to the masses?
Oh, wow. I guess recommending his books. You know, I think that Sowell has produced this oeuvre, this body of work that's going to sell itself over time, mainly because he's so accessible. He is, and that makes him attractive. He's a guy whose erudition is wide, is deep, but also you pick up one of his books and you can understand where he's saying, where he's coming from. And you, if you're someone who has tried to read academics, people you know are brilliant and are brilliant, but can't write, you know that having these two skills, they don't necessarily always come packaged together in one person. We have brilliant people who have a really hard time expressing themselves to people who can't think on their level. Sowell is a deep thinker, but also someone who can write and explain himself, and is remarkably accessible. And I think those books will endure. And along with the fact that he's been so far ahead of the curve on so many issues that he's written about, his writings will have to be grappled with. His ideas will have to be grappled with. And so I think he's put out there a body of work that people will not be able to ignore. I think that social media, and I have a lot of criticisms of social media, but in the case of proselytizing Sowell's work, social media has been huge. Sowell has, just to give you some idea, Sowell is not on social media, has never been on social media, but there is a fan account on social media that has more than 700,000 followers. And all the guy who runs the account does is post quotes from Thomas Sowell's books and previous columns. That's it. There's nothing, there's no added commentary. They're simply direct quotes from his books. More than 700,000 followers.
And you found the guy.
What, I'm sorry?
And you found the guy.
He spoke to me. Yeah, he did. I interviewed him and I talked to him for the introduction of the book. The other thing that has encouraged me about Sowell's work getting out there is I also narrated a documentary film about soul called Thomas Sowell, Common Sense in a Senseless World. It was a film for public television that came out earlier this year, but you could also stream it on YouTube and Amazon and some other platforms. And the producers of the film told me that through the streaming, they were able to gather some demographic information on who was watching the film. And I found it very encouraging that the people trended younger, people in their 20s and 30s and 40s. Another thing that gave me hope was interviewing one of Sowell's colleagues at the Hoover Institution, a man named Peter Robinson, who does an internet show for Hoover, frequently has Tom as a guest whenever Tom has a new book out. So he's interviewed him dozens of times. And Robinson told me that whenever Sowell is a guest, he is the most popular guest they have. And the younger the viewer, the more popular Sowell is with that viewer. So he's getting out there. I think social media has had a lot to do with it. You can look up these old clips of him on YouTube doing his thing, and they have millions of views. It's a wonderful thing.
They do. And I'm going to translate this last question. We've only got 4 minutes remaining here. I'm going to translate this last question into 501c3 nonprofit compliant language. I understand why certain candidates don't want Thomas Sowell's work to be well known, but why do you think other certain candidate office seekers rarely reference his work? Why? So why?
Well, I'll answer that if I understand the question correctly. So much of and this sort of gets back to the difference between the agenda of Black elites and the needs and wants and agenda of everyday Blacks and what they're interested in. But you know, if you're an activist, you're a Black politician trying to get elected, it's very much in your interest to keep racism and discrimination front and center in our discussions. It will always be 1950 for the purposes of advancing of your fundraising, if you're the activist, or getting elected, if you're a Black politician trying to scare people to the polls. And so that's what they do. They're acting out of self-interest. And so much of Sowell's scholarship has undermined those claims, particularly what was going on in Black America in the first half of the 20th century, the progress that was being made prior to affirmative action policies, prior to the Great Society welfare state expansions. That's not a history these other folks want to talk about, because it undermines their claim that these outcomes we see today are all simply a legacy of slavery or Jim Crow. And if you can point to a period in Black history when things were improving at a much faster rate, it completely undermines the narrative that they want to keep front and center for their own interest. And so a lot of Sowell's research in this area does not get a lot of attention because they have no stake in highlighting it. And it simply undermines what they're trying to say to advance their own agenda.
Well, Jason, this has been terrific. The book is Maverick, a biography of Thomas Sowell. I strongly recommend that folks pick up a copy for themselves and consider it as a Father's Day gift. It is a terrific work. I enjoyed every page. I think you hit Dr. Sowell's standard for books in terms of making it chock full of anecdotes and easy to read. And I know he's had a lot of praise for your books in the past. I think we're also seeing some of his characteristic modesty in, not yet having seen effusive praise for this one, with reviews the way, the way he has with your other books and spoken so highly of them. So I strongly recommend folks pick up a copy. At that, thank you all for joining us. Thank you for following Yankee Institute. You can email us at info@yankeeinstitute.org, and we really appreciate you joining us. Good night.
Thank you.